Heather, let me ask you, how do you view, both as someone who's female and as someone who's an evolutionary biologist, how do you conceptualize the difference in status hierarchies in human females and human males? I'd really be interested to hear that.
Yeah, well, this too could go on for 10 years. We are one of very few species that has hierarchies in females and hierarchies in males. Other species tend to have one or the other. There may be a couple, maybe Japanese macaques, if memory serves, that have both. But in those few species that have both, and in all of the species that have one or the other, the hierarchies are created and maintained via different means. And there's variation, of course, but in general, the hierarchy in males in other species and men in humans is through overt means, through fairly direct claims. Sometimes it's physical, but usually the physicality is under the surface, right? It's, it's there as a possibility. Maybe you want to call it a threat, but usually things don't get physical as men are deciding what the hierarchy actually is. But there's direct confrontation of a linguistic sort, of a gestural sort, of oh, you're doing that. I wouldn't do it that way. Or here, let me, we're
that's
together.
Often couched in a joke too.
Oh, and right. And so maybe that could be seen as sort of an end run around the direct provocation, but there's very rarely with men, and maybe this is changing in modern times, but if man A is interested in critiquing man B, he's very unlikely to say, I'm going to take this to man C first. I'm going to go talk to our joint friend, and before I take it directly to the guy with whom I have an issue. Whereas, so that's, that tends to be overt, and female hierarchies tend to be covert in nature. And, this probably originates in part through the fact that even though we seem to be moving more and more towards a monogamous mating system, and we are therefore losing our sexual dimorphism in humans, we still are sexually dimorphic and are still on average smaller and less muscular and less powerful. And so, the ability to back up disagreement with the threat of physicality would have been less successful, certainly engaging with men, but also with other women. And so women are more likely to use social signals and covert signals and less direct signals to assess and to change what the hierarchy is. And there's a ton more to say, but maybe I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So let's switch. You have a chapter on sex and gender, and that would be fun to talk about. So first of all, I'm really curious about if you think those terms are importantly different, and if they are, why, and what they both mean if they're different. So let's start with that.
All right. They are different, but the way in which they relate actually you can deduce from the omega principle, which we haven't talked about yet. But essentially, the way of conceptualizing it is, Heather and I say this slightly differently, but I would say that gender is the software of sex. And
I tend to say that gender is the behavioral manifestation of sex.
And what this means is that these things are housed at a different level. What it does not mean is that they are pointed towards different objectives. So the omega principle, which is one of the important principles that undergirds the logic of the book, is that epigenetic phenomena, including culture and all of the software layer, is more flexible than genes and therefore more rapidly adapting. But it is also subordinate to the genes in terms of objective, because genes are in a perfect position to shut down anything behavioral or cognitive that does not serve their interests, which it won't do instantaneously, but over generations it will. So what we find is gender has to be serving the interests of the genes, and therefore sex and gender should be pointed in the same direction. Now, there's a lot of variation in the gender layer, but it is not a completely independent phenomenon. It is not superior to the underlying genetics.
Okay, so let me ask you about that in terms of personality then, because
Sure.
I've been thinking a lot about the sex and gender issue, the idea that there's an infinite number of genders. And, I like to give the devil his due as much as I possibly can. And one of the things you do see in the personality literature in psychology, which is reasonably well developed, right? I mean, we have a pretty good model of human personality, 5 basic personality traits. Maybe they're subdivisible into 2 subtraits each. So that's 10. It's 5 dimensions of variability. That's a lot. Reality only has 4 dimensions of variability. So what you see is that there are reliable differences between men and women in aggregate in personality. And one of the big differences is that women are about half a standard deviation more sensitive to negative emotion. And they're about half a standard deviation more agreeable, so more compassionate and polite. And it's not that hard to point out that, well, that might be a logical consequence of sexual dimorphism. So women should be a bit more sensitive to threat because they're a bit smaller, but also that they have to, I don't think human adult female personality is adapted to human adult females. I think it's adapted to female infant dyads. And a female infant, because here's why. You don't see those personality differences emerge till puberty. Now, that's also when you get sexual dimorphism, but boys and girls under 12, 11, they're not different in terms of sensitivity to negative emotion. But then puberty hits and the transformation seems permanent. And so it makes sense to me that a creature that has an infant is going to be more sensitive to negative emotion, and also what has to be more agreeable, more compassionate, because, well, it's an infant, right? And compassion is the right emotion for someone under 9 months of age. It's just compassion because, well, they're born so young, right? We have a very short gestation period, and so they're completely helpless. So of course it's compassion. Okay, so now having said those differences exist, and there's some other ones, but they're more trivial. There are lots of women who have male personality patterns. So you find women who are low in negative emotion and low in agreeableness. They're quite masculine that way. And there are men who are quite feminine in their personality characteristics. And then you could also say, well, insofar as personality is associated with gender, well, there is tremendous 10-dimensional variation. And so the idea that gender is fluid in some sense and that it's, not exactly tied to the underlying sexual structure, there's some, when it's not pushed too far, when it's not political in its intent, there's some validity to the claim. So what do you think about that biologically?
Yeah, no, I think this is exactly right. I would, before I answer that though, I would say that no woman who had ever brought a child to term would claim that gestation was short in humans. But, but I do know what you mean. I get your point. But it feels interminable when you're actually undergoing it. With regard to sex versus gender and the sort of, gender is way more fluid than sex. It is. Sex is binary. We are a binarily sexually reproducing species with 2 and only 2 types of gametes. The intermediate type of gamete, which has a little bit of cytoplasm and kind of moves around a little bit, a little bit eggy and a little bit spermy, doesn't work. There's lots of good reasons for this, but the evolution of anisogamy, the 2 different types of gametes, is well understood from both a theoretical perspective and it just manifests, right, in plants and animals, right? So that is true. Sex is binary. And then the expression, the software, to use Bret's framing, or the behavioral manifestation of sex, to use mine. Of course, behavioral manifestation only works for animals. It doesn't work as well for plants. But we see the same kinds of sort of, cultural behavioral manifestation of sex, even in plants, even with regard to eggs being more choosy than pollen in plants with regard to who to mate with. So of course there will be a greater manifestation of ways to engage the world when you're talking about, say, the behavioral manifestation of what your underlying sex is, than there will be for what your actual sex is. And I say that as someone who was gender nonconforming and who was never confused about whether or not I was a girl. This is the conflation these days, right? The idea that gender dysphoria.
It's weird how it's flipped around too, because there's an infinite number of genders. So let's say, but if you're kind of acting girly and you're a boy when you're 3, well, then your sex is wrong. It's like, well, wait a minute. I thought that gender was fluid and it's that it isn't binary. It's like, how come it's linked to sex so tightly all of a sudden when we're talking about, non-stereotypical manifestations of behavior?
It's super regressive too, right? I mean, the idea, growing up in the 70s, I was a girl who didn't like dresses. And the idea that made me a boy would have been considered completely anathema to the second wave feminists among whom I was growing up, right? I was just a girl who liked to get my get myself dirty and play in the dirt and go look for salamanders. That didn't make me a boy. Of course not. Right. So, being interested in things that are maybe more likely to be things that boys are interested in is awesome. And it is a hallmark of modernity that we can embrace such children. And same thing for boys who are interested in things that have traditionally been more likely to be things that girls were either natively interested in or encouraged to be interested in. But it doesn't change the underlying sex at all.
When my son was young, 3 years old, my daughter, who's about 4.5, and her friends used to get together and they'd dress him up as a princess or a fairy, and then he'd prance around the house. And he's quite a masculine boy, by the way. And this actually bothered me, And so I sat down and thought about it for a long time because, well, I didn't know why it bothered me exactly. And then I came to the conclusion that, well, wait a second, because I didn't want him to get confused. Maybe it was something like that. And some of it was probably like arbitrary Northern Alberta prejudice or who the hell knows. But what I realized was that if I interfered with this in any way, that's raised eyebrows or any of that nonverbal stuff, I would be sending a message to my son that playing at being a girl is wrong. And what that meant was that I was telling him that embodying and understanding what it meant to be female was unethical. And that was a very bad idea. And so when you see that sort of gender crossing play take place with kids, especially at that age, you should, take somewhat of a hands-off approach and understand that they are, one of the ways I know who you are is to act you out, to play you out and to imitate you. And it's easy to shut that down. And then you get the kind of divisions between the genders, let's say, or the sexes that aren't good. You can interfere with that very young.